Here in the University Hall. Welcome here in the University Hall, and welcome everyone who is looking online, who is watching today online by our live stream. My name is Hilke Gotelaar and I will be your host for tonight. And this is the last evening in our series Rethinking Global Power, in which we examine the geopolitical chess game between the world powers. And I'm actually curious, who is here for the first time this evening? Can I see hands? Okay. For who is it the second evening? Okay, and the third evening in row? Nice. Yeah, I see some familiar faces. Thank you. And this series is a cooperation of Studium Generale, the Utrecht Centre for Global Challenges and Contesting Governance, and SIB Utrecht. And as you might have noticed, our interviewer of tonight, Ilko Bos van Rosenthal, is on his way. He will be here in some minutes. So I hope you don't mind that we started some minutes later, and we will need possibly some more minutes to answer all your questions. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is one of the bloodiest conflicts in Europe since World War II. It heralds a new era for Europe. What consequences does the war have for the future of European security, and what historical parallels can we draw? These questions and many more will be answered by our guest of tonight, historian Professor Beatrice de Graaf. Beatrice de Graaf is faculty professor of History of International Relations and Global Governance at Utrecht University, and the overarching research theme of Beatrice is the history of security and counterterrorism from the 19th century. She examines how states and societies try to maintain a high level of security and how this relates to core values and institutions such as democracy, the rule of law, and the Constitution. Before we start with the interview, let me end by sharing some practicalities. Those of you who were here before know already how the format of the evening is. The interview will be divided in 3 parts. The first part is always on the war in Ukraine. And after each part, there will be room for your questions, both here and also those who are watching online. You can post your questions in the chat and I will post them for you. The second part of the evening will be about the historical perspective, and the last part will be the now and the future of Europe. So I kindly ask you to post your questions with regard to the theme we are talking about. And after each part, there will be plenty time for that. So now we have to wait for Ilko, but oh, wow! Hey. Perfect.
Sorry.
Ja hoor, nee hoor.
And let's give a warm applause to for our guest, Professor Beatrice de Graaf.
Thank you, Beatrice, for coming. Sorry to keep you waiting. I just decided after 2 trains were cancelled that I'm going to move to Utrecht, which is more beautiful than Amsterdam anyway. But apologies for keeping you waiting. And thank you for being here, Beatrice. We have a lot to cover. I know you a bit. Once you get one question, you solve the whole every world problem. Let's start with the topic we start each interview with in this series, and that is Europe's response to the war in Ukraine. There is a lot to parse, but if we get to the basics of it, were you pleasantly surprised or disappointed by the European stance after February 24th, when Russia started invading?
Well, thank you, Ilko, for being here, for the question, and for having this introduction, because I think it's indeed the most pressing crisis at present that also heavily affects all the other crises that we have to deal with, and certainly we'll come on to that later. The war in Ukraine, well, as for so many other people, the war as such surprised me, that Europe would be able to rally behind the flag and would get his game going did not so much surprise me.
Behind the Ukrainian flag.
Behind the Ukrainian flag, exactly, to get its game together as a EU and start offering humanitarian aid, income of refugees, but also economic aid, that it debarked on sanctions against Russia, and that it also supported Ukraine militarily, and that it heavily participated from the day that the war started in the NATO military deployment at the eastern border. So it not so much surprised me, because that's what I have been trained for. What was pleasant, however, is that it went far much smoother than I thought that it would be. Where I was a bit disappointed is the amount of money involved in it. I don't know if you follow the way the EU is supporting Ukraine. For example, the US has supported Ukraine since February 24 with, if I'm correct, $52 billion, and that's more than 2 times as much as the EU has.
With 12 billion more coming before the end of the year.
Exactly. Biden just decided upon that, and the EU has supported Ukraine with, I think, 16 billion euros, with 1.45 more coming in the coming months. So it's far less than the US has done. And of the 16 billion, Germany pays the most, 3.3, and apart from the EU, the UK on its own is paying with almost $7 billion. So that's quite a lot of money going into the Ukraine, but the US is doing the most. So Zelensky is now really anxious looking at the outcome of the elections.
We'll get to the money part and why Europe is behind so much if you compare to the US in a second. But the first part of your answer, saying that you were, well, pleasantly surprised or at least happy about the rallying behind the flag part. What did you expect? Because you still sound a little surprised.
Well, where I was a bit concerned was how not so much the north and the southern countries of the EU, but the east and the western countries would work together. And also among the eastern countries of the EU, there's quite some debate and difference in positions towards Russia. So that's where I had my doubts. Will they get their grip together politically speaking? What we could have known from the past, I mean, what we read about the EU in preparation for this meeting tonight, I decided to read closely the newspapers, the Dutch newspapers, over the past 2 weeks in order to check what's in there on the EU and the EU cooperation. Well, I'm reading, of course, all the good newspapers. I'm not going into detail what newspapers they are, but solid newspapers, and almost none of them had a serious contribution on what the EU actually is doing, which is quite a lot. But in social media and all around you, you hear all the times news of the EU is costing us too much, the EU is not doing enough, the EU isn't not there, it's a bunch of coward people, which is not true, because if you check the crisis that the EU has been through over the past 10 years, first we had the financial crisis, 2009 till 2012, which was solved in the end with the major innovation of the Eurobonds and investment in the Eurozone for I think $800 billion. So the Greek and Italy and all the other countries, they were bailed out practically. And now we're not talking anymore about financial crisis, it's solved. The next crisis was the refugee crisis, the income. It's not so much a crisis of the refugees, but a crisis of how the EU internally dealt with it. 2015, 2016, again, that was also dealt with predominantly by Germany, but also Austria and also the other countries, even with the Dublin system broken down. So then the COVID crisis was also solved by a major EU procurement program for making vaccines. So if you look at it objectively, evidence-based, they did what they could. It was solid crisis management, and loads of money went into it. So from that tendency, you would expect it. What happened now exactly is that they would get their grip together and support the Ukraine. The question is, why do we think that the EU is so bad at it? Because that's still the overriding consciousness, that the EU is not doing enough, that it's not working, that it's broken down.
Would the answer be, oh, you're asking me the questions?
Yes.
All right. Well, I mean, the effect of populist parties that keep telling us that the EU is a mess, that they spend too much money, etc., etc. I mean, we've seen it here, we've seen it in France, we've seen it in Germany, and European politicians almost seem afraid of that, right? I mean, they're not really good in either marketing or bragging about what they have accomplished, or am I wrong?
Well, perhaps they would be good in it if they would be willing to do so, but I can't see our Prime Minister willing to brag about EU at all. I mean, I'm sure that he could.
For electoral reasons, right?
For electoral reasons, yes, exactly. And then I'm also a bit disappointed that newspapers, that journalists, that pundits, that talk shows do not follow suit at all. I mean, it was a brilliant piece of Colijn in the NRC 2 days ago. And he said, do we pay enough attention about what's happening with nuclear armament and weapons in the EU and the US? No, he said, the talk show night when a big decision was being made about renovation of new nuclear weapons, what was the talk show about? Glenys Grace's incident. I mean, that's how we Dutch are wired right now.
Yeah, I have nothing to say about that. But it's true.
But you're a journalist.
Yes, but I don't work for a talk show.
No, okay, you work with newsers doing the good stuff.
Yeah, well, we try, but we have not covered the Glenys Grace scandal.
Very good, yeah.
About the money part and the fact that the US pays twice as much as Europe. I mean, the old...
more.
Right. The old phrase is that the Americans come from Mars and the Europeans come from Venus, right? We don't understand hard power, even though we've dealt with hard power. I mean, 2 world wars pretty recently, the wars in Bosnia and Kosovo. So is it a cliche which is not true, or is that behind the fact that the US is paying so much more?
Well, the cliche. It's a bit a cliche because it's framed in a psychological way, and it's not about psychology. It's about hard military equipment. I mean, what is the U.S. delivering to the Ukraine? Hundreds of how do you pronounce it? Humvees. Hundreds of Humvees. Other very big, heavy armaments, materials, munition. If you take into account how many heavily armored vehicles and ordinary tanks NATO has, I think it's 800 with 200 heavy tanks, and that's not near enough for the countries itself. And Scholz, Chancellor Scholz of Germany, is complaining that he doesn't even have enough resources and industrial energy to produce the munition or the tanks, the heavy aircraft necessary for Germany, let alone that he can export it to Ukraine. So it's not so much a psychological deficit as it is a military industrial deficit, that the EU is not capable of producing the amount of military support that the US is now delivering in kind to Ukraine.
How, I mean, is this winter, because of energy reasons and also because of maybe a Ukraine fatigue, will the next few months be a stress test for solidarity with Ukraine in Europe, but also in the US? We have midterms today. The Republicans may get back in power in Washington, at least in Congress, which means that the money flowing to Ukraine may, not certain, but get less. So are the next few months determinative in a sense for Ukraine?
Yes, most certainly so. I mean, you talk about fatigue. Do you see fatigue in Europe at present for supporting the Ukraine? I don't see it in Europe so much. It's more dependent, as you say, rightly, on the midterm outcomes in the US, where the Biden government has certainly dedicated itself to continuous support of Ukraine, but also there's not just the Republicans, also within the Democrats, the hard left of the Democrats, many Sanders supporters, not Sanders himself, but his supporters, they also are quite hard against additional support. It's a very nasty, turning into a very nasty debate, because hard left activists, parliamentarians, politicians in US are now saying, well, why should we support white, blonde children? Well, we should pour the money into the black ghettos. It's not my words, it's what the hard left people in the Sanders camp say. So there's a debate in the US indeed ongoing. So it depends very much on the president incumbent.
Right. And what about Europe? Because no, I don't. Well, I guess I see some fatigue, not much. But do you see none, either with the general public or with politicians? I mean, stressing that Ukraine and Russia should start negotiating, in a way, is an expression of fatigue, and we see that happening every now and then.
Well, there's two things. I'm not sure whether stressing the value of negotiation is a sign of fatigue or weakness. I think it always needs to be underlined and compounded and stressed if there is any opening or any moment. I'm a very strong supporter of keep the military support for Ukraine ongoing, but I'm also very strong supporter of diplomacy. And Harland recently again argued that diplomacy is highly underrated, and it's sort of becoming a lost art into international politics and geopolitics. It's all about more rockets, more sanctions, more this and that, and negotiation. Not trying to argue with Zelensky and say you have to this. I mean, the negotiations have to start with Zelensky, but we have to offer him support. And you saw how Erdogan was able, with the grain deal, to do exactly that, to weigh in, and with diplomatic effort was able to get Putin on board again and getting him back on the grain trail. So diplomacy is always a thing that we should keep in mind. It's sort of retracted back into the background because of what the Russians are doing, not Ukrainians. But it would be now time, and we have this discussion in the Netherlands as well, if we start discussing negotiations and what would the role of the EU and the US then be. I mean, it starts with Zelensky and Putin. What the EU could do is, of course, offer Zelensky all the support there is, but there was a discussion in the Netherlands within the Ministry of Defense and Foreign Office. If we support Zelensky, and the war in Ukraine is over the coming 3-4 months going more in the direction of Ukraine gradually recovering terrain, perhaps getting back Kherson, and then pushing the Russians back to Donetsk and Lugansk, to the borders there. Would we then say, please Zelensky, start the negotiations with the borderlines of Donetsk and Lugansk? Or do we say, no, you're able to keep the fight going on until you've regained Crimea back?
Well, that's that would be my following question. We can talk about negotiations, and Europe can carefully, it should always be on the horizon, I guess. But with what starting point? Until they're out of Lugansk and Donetsk, or even Crimea? I mean, Kherson is probably not enough. So what do you think would be a wise, the minimum of a Russian pullout in order to start negotiations?
Well, Biden just came with an offer and said the minimum is the border of 24th of February, when the war started, so 9 months ago.
Right.
And that would be the border up until the Crimea, and not much more, not more at all. So for Zelensky said that for him the border is the integral territory of the Ukraine as such, but does he also mean the Crimea with it or not? And from a legal point of view, you could either consider the Crimea occupied territory, or you could consider it illegal, unlawful warfare. So if it's a country in war, you're entitled to continue the war up until the territory of the Crimea. If you say, no, it's a kind of solidified occupational zone, then it's another situation legally. I'm not an international law specialist. I'm a bit cautious here to say more, but this discussion has not been solved yet within the EU as we speak. And I'm a bit hesitant to offer any take here myself, because I'm not a legal specialist.
We'll talk also about the historical perspective, and in a minute I also want to give the first round of questions to the audience. But just back to the war in February 24, you say that the European response has been you're happy with that, besides the money, or at least you were...
I was not surprised. I could be more happier if more money is going to be poured into it. Yeah.
Yeah. What is certain is that even though American intelligence in the last weeks leading up to the war, and they shared it with the European allies, so I guess we knew it was coming, but not for very long. Everybody agrees that Europe has made a mistake by, they should have seen this coming. Perhaps in 2007, when Putin gave his famous speech in Munich, which was very hostile towards Europe.
Are we already going back into the historical past? Because
I mean, I guess the more
I'm far
recent...
more comfortable with the past than I'm with the present or the future, to be honest. Yeah.
Well, I guess the more recent past. Let's just start with the question. Where did that's a very leading question, but I'll phrase it anyway. Where did the European naivety when it comes to Russia start? When?
Well, again, that's quite insinuative phrasing of the word.
Deliberately.
I know. Naivete is a difficult term for an historian, because with backside you always knew better. We knew it all along. In fact, yes, of course Putin is a lunatic. Why didn't we see it coming? That's always a case if you reason back in time, and many people blamed Merkel for it. They blamed Gerhard Schröder for it already. They blamed the Dutch government for it, for engaging in all that energy and gas deals with the Russians. So we've been all naive, and perhaps we've all been wedded to a specific take on collective security in history, namely that things work best for every party engage if you work together, if you engage in energy deals, if you engage in economic deals, and Russia certainly has profited so much from deals with the EU, with Germany. It still does, by the way. We are still, all of us together, the EU countries together, are still keeping Russia afloat. I mean, the increase of export of Russian oil and gas the increase has not increased, but it has increased over the past months. So we haven't stopped it. That's the stupid part of it. So we still are naive in a way. So it's not perhaps so much...
We still fund the war, basically.
Yes, we're still very much wedded to our interests. And the take on collective security was gradually, step by step, as with the Cold War, in a kind of an interdependencia theoretical way of trying to merge interest, trying to weave together a pattern of economic, financial, cultural ties. We can make it work together. And it could have worked, and Putin himself, but also Medvedev in the past, they also seem to have chosen that direction. But there always was this darker, this shadow side behavior of Putin, and he has decided to let that side prevail. So it was his choice, his agency, and not so much EU naivety, I would say. I mean, it could have worked the other way around from a historical point of view, and I think in 10 or 20 years from here, we will look back and say it was Putin's biggest mistake, Russia's biggest downfall at all in the 21st century. Well,
but you're mostly talking now also about energy and gas deals, etc. But I mean, Russia's cruelty. The takeover of Crimea, which perhaps was not, obviously it was not bloody in the sense that this war is, but it happened in 2014, and he was not uninvited from any summit, or perhaps only briefly. The cruelty that Russia was responsible for in Syria, which may feel further away or is further away than Ukraine, but it was cruel, cruel, cruel. Yet nobody really cared. I mean, he was still invited to every summit, NATO or well, not NATO, but G7 or whatever. Isn't that naive?
Well, there may be historians or political scientists in the Netherlands who would now stand up and start to defend Putin or blame the EU and the US for that. I'm not one of them, so I'm not going to disagree with you. You're completely right. It's a fundamental different cultural mindset, a cultural worldview, and also a different psychological makeup of Putin and his siloviki, his strongman, which is not to say that the whole of Russian society, of course, is sharing his views with him, but we don't know much about it because public opinion is completely oppressed and not free at the moment in Russia. So it's difficult to generalize generalize for an historian, generalizing things as cruelty, the cruelty of the Asian people, the backwardness of the, well, that's not something that you should do anymore. That's a kind of a biased, and I would say flawed way of reasoning with history. What we see is deliberate, intentional decisions made by Putin and the people surrounding him to disrespect basic human law, to disrespect civil liberties, to disrespect collective security and cooperational regimes, and to embark on a survival of the fittest course, embark on a ruthless, perhaps ruthless more than cruel, a ruthless approach to human lives, and the whole tender edifice of international treaties and what have you.
I guess I mean that it apparently took February 24 for us to really realize that.
Yeah, and
even though the evidence was in Aleppo and the evidence was in Crimea,
yes,
and the evidence was in Navalny's jail.
Yeah, and in 2014 already, with the taking over of the Crimea. And you could also say the downing, and especially the reaction, the response of Russia to the downing of the MH217. Yeah.
One more thing before we go to the first round of audience questions, and that also has to do with the European response to this war, because it has been a long desire by the French mostly to build a European army, and many countries were opposed to that. The US doesn't want it because we have NATO. I had expected that after February 24 there would be more calls for this, but it hardly happened. I mean, it's a bang it's a drum that the French bang every now and then, but
you don't hear them banging that drum right now so much, because in times of crisis, in times of high pressure, what you fall back onto is the things that you've been training for. From the morning of the 25th of February onwards, immediately the NATO Rapid Response Force was triggered, which is not an EU military setting, but it's a NATO setting where the French participate, the Dutch participate. I was invited to the airfield somewhere in the Netherlands because they wanted to have a very brief lecture on what Putin wants, because I've been telling that on the television. So they hauled me to the airplane and said, our boys, it's about 18, 19 of them, the fighter jet pilots, our boys are now flying over with the French, the Italians, the Germans, the Polish, to the border of Ukraine. They're doing their rounds and they'll be back this evening. They are risking their lives because the Russians are targeting them with their laser and the radar equipment. So the aircraft, they noticed that, they identified it, and the Russians do not stay out of the border zone for 1.5 miles. They deliberately fly over it a bit, so they're very aggressively putting everything at risk. So that's where the fighter pilots of the EU are participating in, but at such a high pressure, delicate, you would almost say a dance, because they don't land. They get their fuel in the air. So it's a kind of a coordination game between French airplanes, Polish airplanes, Germans, and the Netherlands. They fly over and fly back, and they rotate, and they do this all together. And this is the whole war game scenario that the NATO has been training for. The EU doesn't have anything like that in place. And we all know, if fire breaks out, if an explosion arrives, what you do, you fall back and your patterns that you've been used, that you trained for, and that's all NATO-based. So there is now, at this moment, there's no room for a new or an additional setting up of military cooperation.
NATO is doing everything it can, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Are there questions from the audience? And again, we'll get to the history later and to the question what Putin wants, because if you gave that lecture at the airfield, you can do it here. But questions about the European response to the war in Ukraine? Anyone? Otherwise, I'll point to someone.
Hello. I know it's a legal question, but I'm still interested. When is a war legal?
That's a very good question. a war is legal if a country is attacked, if its territory is being violated by another party, or if you're part of a treaty alliance, if a country of that alliance is being violated, like the NATO Article 5 paragraph. Now, in this case, Ukraine is not part of the NATO, so for us, Article 5 has not been violated, nor is Ukraine our territory. But, however, what you could argue with is that Ukraine is part of the EU collective security system. There are agreements, the Paris Treaty and the Budapest Treaty, they are now being violated by Russia. So Ukraine is entitled to fight back, and its partners, in one way or the other, are also entitled to support Ukraine with military aid, financial aid, economic aid. And it's not something that Russia has made a casus belli out of it. So Russia has de facto accepted it. It has not launched war against other NATO EU countries for them supporting Ukraine. So from an international legal point of view, Ukraine is entitled to fight back, and partner countries are entitled to support Ukraine with their aids. That's another thing altogether if we would start a fight on Russian territory ourselves. And that's again a gray zone, because what I said before, Russia is triggering risk systems at the border of the NATO zone, and it's flying over it. It's been nicking things in the camera equipment for drones in, I think it was Sweden, and it also engaged in cyber attacks against EU countries. So what exactly makes a country violating the other's territorial spheres? Is it the cyber sphere as well? So there is this gray zone. So you could equally argue that Russia overstepped that borders, but no one wants to trigger an all-out war between NATO and Russia for obvious reasons.
Hi. How do we prepare to bridge the gap between giving money and weapons to Ukraine and not depleting our own stockpiles? Because at the moment...
sorry, I can't hear you auditively.
Yeah. How do we bridge the gap between having zero weapons ourselves, because we all gave them to Ukraine, and the new orders that we're placing right now? While Scholz says we cannot even produce our own tanks, let alone lend them out. How do you think we should handle that? Because the US is not going to be able to provide as much for Europe because they'll need it themselves.
I think that's framing it a bit too much black and white. There's no such a case that there are zero weapons in the EU, because there's quite a lot of them, actually. At least in a nuclear perspective, there are too much. And on the ground, there is enough aircraft at the moment and armored vehicles, and the Germans are complaining bitterly, but they're also trying to wind up the industrial output. The US is exporting things to and fro as we speak. Rotterdam Harbour is being used for that. Our infrastructure, railway infrastructure, is being used for it. If you pay notice, you see it being transported over the roadways and the normal ways. So it's not. There is a backlog, but it's being bridged as we speak, but only gradually. Not quick enough to Zelensky's likings. But the Russians have their backlog too. No? The Russians also have problems in getting their people. Some people argue, Kokolijn has written extensively about it, that they don't even have enough fine-tuned electronic gear to wire all the weapon systems that they have. I mean, last year, before the war started, Putin boasted about his new sonic weapon systems and his heavily armed drones. He had to buy them from Iran or get them. Get help from Turkey. Yeah.
You mentioned that the United States gives a lot of money, a huge amount of money to support the war in Ukraine, as compared to Europe, and sort of intriguing because the main enemy or opposing nation of the U.S. is China at the moment. So what is their motive to put that much money in this war? Could you give an explanation?
Thank you. That's a very Can I answer it? Or
Yes,
would
of
you?
course. I
Yeah.
think the question was meant for you. Yes.
Oh, you could answer
No,
it too.
no.
Well, that's an excellent question because it shows how much President Biden is embedded, is still pivotal to, let's say, the old-fashioned transatlantic collective security system that has been created and consolidated after the Second World War and then compounded after the fall down of the Berlin Wall in 1989. So he's still very much part and parcel, and he's been a transatlanticist ever since. He's been warning for Russia when he was a senator before. So he's been saying this all along, and now he's acting out. And that's perhaps one of the biggest lucky moments in history, that we have him as a president, because he still completely understands the necessity of supporting the EU and also Ukraine as partly European country in this looming threat of Russia, that Russia has now triggered. US hasn't triggered it, Russia has triggered it. Obama was far more orientating himself towards the pivot towards Asia. That was far more what he was doing. I think he would have supported this as well. He also made this pledge to Angela Merkel when she was still chancellor, that he would still be wedded to the transatlantic bounds and he would support European security, because the EU and the US together still form this powerful bloc. What Biden has done instead is stepping up the rhetorics against China more than the EU has been doing. So that's interesting that you say that the biggest enemy or threat for the US is China. China is still one of the biggest, perhaps the biggest partner, at least the biggest import partner for Germany, for example. So for the EU, things are a little bit different. So the triangle EU, US, China is more complex than you think.
But it is a very good point that the war in Russia is obviously a distraction for the US, because they still want to pivot to Asia and focus on China. Biden was also part of the Obama administration that made the famous reset with the relationship with Russia, which now sounds, well, which now sounds naive as well, even though you don't like that.
It was a good, it was worth a try.
It was worth a try, okay.
It still is.
Okay. Maybe one more question from the audience, if there is one, and otherwise, okay.
Thank you. Sorry, what are your thoughts on the European foreign volunteers who have come to Ukraine to fight? Do you think that they will have any significant impact, either militarily or politically?
Yeah, that's a good question. As a terrorism researcher with that hat on, I was immediately triggered by the conflict in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, one has to say, because one of the biggest correlations between time and terrorism, so where and when does terrorism emerge, is in situations and areas where there is already a war going on. If you now look at the world map, there's a couple of spots where terrorism soars high. That's in Afghanistan again. It still is in Syria, in Iraq, and partly in Nigeria. So it's on places where there is already a war or a civil war or failed state-related war going on. So having another conflict, war so close home, could be triggering, as Syria did for IS's rise to power, could trigger another terrorist-related hotbed of radicalization. However, so far, if I am taking the numbers in correctly. For example, the Foreign Office of the Netherlands doesn't make any hard statements on this, but it's probably around 10 or a dozen of Dutch people who traveled to Ukraine to support Zelensky and fight. Perhaps a little bit more that we don't know of, but it's nothing compared to the more than 300 that went off to fight for IS. From Germany, there's also people going, more of them are going to Ukraine, from the US even, but it's not a substantial amount of people in the sense that we should be afraid for them returning and being radicalized and acting out here. It still could be the case. People who participated in warfare are often come home traumatized, especially if they've not been trained well and don't have a debrief properly as military officials do. So it still is a danger, it's a risk, and they should be controlled, which they are. But it's nothing substantial compared to what we had with foreign fighters going to IS.
Why do you compare those two, those radicalizing and going to Syria and the ones fighting in Ukraine? I think it's interesting.
It's professional deformation. It's I
thought so.
It's radicalization. You can have a jihadist radicalization, left-wing radicalization, right-wing radicalization. It's a form of radicalization.
How is it? I mean, I would not go to Ukraine to fight, but
no, you're not radicalized yet.
We can go together. But what is the
No, I'm not going there. No.
What is the radicalization? I mean,
well,
what happens? I know you're not a psychologist, but what happens in?
Yes. Well, the definition of radicalization is an increased willingness to act out, to protest against a system or society, a political entity, and increasingly so by means of violence and arms. So people want to be are willing to take up arms. In that sense, you may be right if it's a country that the Netherlands is befriended with. So it's not so much a political protesting our regime or a specific ideology as wanting to support a country in distress. But it still is, if you're doing it on your individual ways and means, without being enlisted in a professional army, without having been trained as a military, it's a kind of an amateur way of radicalizing yourself into use of violence, which is a means to an end. And if the end is supporting Ukraine, that's obviously a different political ideological end than supporting IS.
Right. Okay, let's go, unless there's another question. No. Let's go to the...
there are three more
there is.
questions.
Okay, final one here. I just don't know where the microphone is. 1 second, everybody can hear it,
It's a short question. What's the risk that the war is becoming a frozen war, which will take a long time to solve? And what are the consequences there?
Well, the risk of a frozen war is what we have been witnessing for the past decades between North and South Korea, for example. It's loss of human lives, it's endless misery, and a breakup of human relations, of families falling apart. So it's humanitarian distress, mostly, and it's also an ongoing hazard and liability directly at the borders of our collective security systems. It's not frozen yet. I mean, it has been far more dynamic than we all have expected. And,
I guess a frozen war in the sense of the Koreas also means that there are no, besides the families that have been separated, there are no victims at this point.
Exactly. Frozen means that there's no actual shooting and fighting anymore, that it's kind of frozen, and external parties have also weighed in on the conflict like China and US has done, and that's not the case yet in this conflict. It's only frozen because of the winter months, but it still is ongoing. We just heard the reports today. The hundreds of Russian soldiers perished again. Russia is continuing its bombardments on electricity plants, energy infrastructure, water systems in Ukraine, so it's not frozen at all at the moment.
Let's go to Putin's motivations, as far as we know, for doing this. And I guess there are two main possible motives, which are not mutually exclusive, but he's against NATO expansion and that whole part, but he's also in favor of the historic idea of a grand Russia, and Ukraine is part of that. Is it one of each, or is it both, or is it something completely different?
Sorry, I'm looking up a quotation by Putin himself, and I lost the last part of your sentence. Sorry, Ilko. Could you repeat it again?
That's fine. That happens at home.
Multitasking late at night is not a good thing to do, but I have to find the citation.
I thought you were going to call him, but...
I don't know if that's allowed.
No, the question was, well, let's that could have been shorter. What do you think was his main motivation for doing what he did?
Well, that's a very good question. But it's also, as an historian, history is never monocausal. It's never one-dimensional. So the motivations, neither are our motivations. If you do something difficult, complex, it's never one single motivation, something that's been triggering you to do it. There's a deeper cause, there's sentiments involved that's perhaps not even articulated in your own head. So what ultimately moves Putin, we don't know, and it's more complex than we think. I mean, when the war broke out, there were many pundits and commentators who said, he's gone mad, he's gone off his bollocks, he's lunatic, and many known colleagues of us also said so. I never believed that really, because what you said before, it's a series of stepping stones, is a stepping up, a radicalization process. Where this can be considered now a logical step. We should have seen it coming. But if you connect the dots back into the history from 2000 already onwards, so not the past 2 years, not from 2014, but from 2000 onwards, there is this trend, I already hinted upon that, of Putin's radicalization along this darker, this black path. So the motivation for that is not just plain irrational. It's not completely lunatic, it's not completely irrational, it's also highly ideological. So it's opportunistic. He thought he could get away with it, with US weakened by the period of Trump, Merkel gone into retirement, the East European countries perhaps siding with him, so he thought he could pull it off, but the deeper lying reason for wanting it at all has to do with what Putin himself already called in 2000. He said, 2000, that's that citation that I just was looking for. In 2000, when he was already inaugurated as president, he said, the Soviet Union, the communists, they made a mistake. They thought that communism could deliver paradise to the people. He really said that, but it couldn't. And then their biggest mistake was, he said, that they left Russia, the Russian people, with a moral vacuum. A moral and ideological vacuum. And we all know, he says, that you cannot rule Russia if the people have nothing to live for, to believe in. So what I'm going to do, and that's also something that he announced in 2000, I'm going to restore the Holy Russian Empire as the new creed of the Russian people. And that's the way to bring ourselves forward. And in the beginning, in 2000, and that's something that we put down in an article, and I have to now pay respect to my colleague, my former student, who now works at Klingendahl. He's one of the best Russian experts, it's Niels Drost. And he was my student over the past 2 years, and he collected, he's also a very clever computer nerd boy. He's not a nerd, but he can do those things and I can't. And but I'm also a nerd perhaps, but in a different way. Well, at least he collected 11,000 speeches and statements of Putin in Russia from the website of the Kremlin, other websites. It's now all gone down, so we're the only ones to have those materials. And a colleague of us in Leuven has them. And he made a kind of...
It's gone down, it disappeared from their website?
They wiped the website, they brought down the whole website, so it's no longer there. So it's brilliant materials, and everything what Putin or Medvedev said anywhere was put on those websites. So Niels got it all down, downloaded, put it in a program, and together we crafted coding words in how Putin used history. Because I have been noticing, I've studied Russia for 1 year, and I've always been fascinated. I'm not a Russian expert, but I have been following the country. And what I noted was that Putin was increasingly, from 2000 onwards, is already something that struck me, has been using anecdotes from the lives of the Tsars. And not just using anecdotes, he started to create and erect numerous monuments and statues. If you now visit St. Petersburg or Moscow, perhaps not now, but hopefully in a year or so, or 2 years, there's all those statues that have been recreated, and he also recreated all the churches, the Orthodox churches that had been erased and to the ground by the Soviet predecessors. So he created them, he rebuilt them, and he was increasingly using them in the speeches. So what we did, we coded all the references to history, to the Tsars, to Christianity that Putin was using, and a couple of weeks before the invasion, Niels defended his thesis, his student thesis, and then Klingendahl snitched him away. I wanted him to write a PhD thesis on, perhaps he's going to do it, but we now made a scientific journal article out of it. It will be published in a week. I already sent it to Ilko, where we traced and delineated how Putin has made use of the history, and what you see happening, that he is increasingly using the darker episodes, the more authoritarian Tsars, the invasions, the conquests that Russia made in the past, and he's done so in various frequencies. for example, in 2000, he still very much stressed that Christianity and Russian Orthodoxy is diverse, and it's open, and it's cosmopolitist, and he cited Alexander I a lot. Alexander I is the Tsar who conquered Napoleon. Not a simple means, but Alexander was also a Tsar who said, we are European, we work with the Europeans, and let all those flowers blossom, it's no problem. And then increasingly, Putin started 2004, the first color revolution, he starts to quote Ivan the Terrible. And he is at first he is being named himself Putin the Great, he likes that, and then he was being named Putin the Terrible, he liked that too. And then increased after 2007, 2008, the war in Georgia, he started to quote Catherine with her invasions and conquest of the Crimea. 2011, it's the protests in Moscow. So what you see is a trajectory where real-life events in Putin's reign that are not playing out according to his script book prompt him to choose for a more authoritarian choice, a rhetoric, and then also a choice of action. And that's also what happened in 2014, and then obviously now as well. So it's the rhetorics, the actions that are being sparked, not, as some of my colleagues stated, by actions that the EU took, or the US did. They were really inspired, and we can map that, the rhetorics, on what's happening in Russia, in the Soviet Russian Empire as such. So it's not so much the EU that has been triggering it with a concrete action.
Then what is, because I did read the article you sent me this morning, and it's obviously a quest for what is the ideological and the religious script and historical script as a basis for the invasion. But can you talk more about the ideology? I mean, what is the ideology besides the Grand Russia that drove him into doing this?
Well, it's the ideology of the strongman, and that's for Putin, first of all, very biographical. He grew up as a street boy in St. Petersburg, where his mother was a very devout Christian, and he's been citing and referencing to her from the moment on that he's been quoted in the newspapers at also already from the 90s onward, and he says she was very pious and very devout. She baptized me herself, and she told me everything about the Bible, and with respect to my mother, I always have a Bible with me in the planes that I fly, and an icon. Perhaps she gave it, I don't quite remember that. An icon. An icon, what Russians use to pray to. So it can be, of course, and lots of people, and you may ask me that as well, say, yeah, well, Beatrice, it's just something that he does. It's the props that he uses to set the stage. How can you be so sure that he is meaning this, that he's serious on this? No, we can't. But if someone uses the same props and the same language and the same references over more than 20 years, it's a hell of a job to being so schizophrenic and not believing it yourself at all. So what I think is that we should depart from our perhaps Western, individualized, Protestant way of thinking religion. If you're being a religious person, you're very, you're doing good deeds, and you have a good conscience, and you're perhaps pacifist, and, in the
Don't look at me in this particular.
No, I was thinking, there was this discussion in the Trouw newspaper where a journalist said, he can't be a Christian because he's so cruel. Well, Christians can be cruel. I mean, I'm a Christian myself, I can be cruel. No, not like Putin, but that's not an argument, of course. It's a very collectivist, ethnic, nationalist way of acting out your belief. It's perhaps comparable to the Irish question, the Irish, the Protestant and the Catholics. Were they really devout Protestants and Catholics? It was very much connected to the territory. It's perhaps how the Dutch were Protestant in the 19th century. So there is this trend of collectivist, almost social ethnic kind of belief systems to which Putin subscribed, and he is convinced that this is the way that brings the Russians forward. So this biographical, ideological element. Then is the second element, the orthodoxy brand that Putin subscribes to is a highly authoritarian, patriarchic, masculine version of Christianity. It's the Russian Orthodox brand. Over millions, I think 60 million of Russians are Orthodox. And according to Putin, This is true Christianity. It's Christianity which has not been degenerated into decadent gay parades. It's not degenerated in same-sex marriages. It's still the man at the helm of the family and the state. And that's a kind of, I don't know if you ever visited Athos, this part of Greek or the northern Greek Meteora cloisters. If you watch the priests strolling around there, they're very intimidating, they loom large, they're very masculine, there's all kinds of imagery of slaying dragons. Well, this is exactly the place that in 2003 Putin visited. He went there and he sat on the protected throne of, and that's this, so it's the biographical thing, it's the masculine patriarchal thing, and then there's also the historical part that Putin really sees himself in a deep historical tradition, a deep historical line, which also bends towards the future of the Byzantine emperors.
Right. But also in the line of the Tsars, in a way.
The Tsars, for Putin, well, I can't find the quote right now, but it's in the article. I think also in 2007-8, and then again around the war in Georgia, Putin said there is now a third Rome. The first Rome being the Rome of Julius Caesar and the first Christian emperors, and then the second Rome was Istanbul, Constantinople, the second cradle of Christianity, but that all degenerated, that went away, the West is now too liberal, and Istanbul, Constantinople is now Muslim, so the third the third place where the eternal flame of the gospel now burns brightly is Moscow. We have most of the Orthodox believers. It's the holy Byzantine Empire all along. It's Holy Russian Empire. And in 2000 already, Putin reintroduced both the Tsarist anthem, the Byzantine Tsarist anthem, and the Tsars are then the successors of the Byzantine Empire. When he was inaugurated for president the last time, 2018, he let that be sung as well, and it starts with "Hail, hail the Russian Tsar, our holy Tsar who reigns from high." So it's Christianity, ideology, territory, ultranationalism, all mixed together in a highly explosive mixture. And the last point that points to this third Rome theory is that the emperor that rules the third Rome is considered the categon. You may have heard the term categon from catechismus. People who went to this Christian education, is called catechism. But categon is the one who teaches and the one who stops. And what does he teach and what does he stop? He stops the devil from taking over the world. It's a highly apocalyptical, eschatological worldview, which is there from the ancient old Christian traditions. And it says, as long as there's a holy Roman Empire, there won't be an end of the world by the hands of the Satan. It will only be there if God comes from high. So the emperors were, and the last emperor from the Holy German Empire also considered himself a categon, is the one who stops the Satan and defends the true creed. And what is Putin doing right now? He's saying we are not fighting the Nazis only against Ukraine, we're fighting the Satanists. So he appropriates language that we do not recognize anymore, but for true Orthodox believers, it all makes sense. It's very simple and straightforward. He is the beacon to true believers, and he fights the Satan in the guise of the Dragon Slayer.
I guess the question is, but it's hard for you probably to answer that, but if anybody besides himself subscribes to that, perhaps part of the older generation of Russians, but I mean, does it work in order to keep the Russian people rallied behind this war? I mean, he seems to be living in a parallel universe, believing that, I mean, Russia is not an economic superpower anymore. Russia is not a military superpower anymore. Their equipment is old. They're losing this war, or at least not winning it. So I can't talk about his mental state, but he's obviously in a different... His idea of where he is with this war is not where he is.
There's a very interesting historical parallel. at the moment when the papal reign and the papal states were falling apart in the 1860s of the 19th century, when France was taking over and the Italians were taking over, Garibaldi was marching towards Rome, what did the Pope do? Did the Pope give in and say, well, we're now trying to settle the matters amongst each other and get a compromise? No, he unleashed the papal ban, and he unleashed the encyclic that says the papal infallibility. So the ideology of the Catholic faith became even more rigid, more staunch, more radical, while being under threat. And that's exactly what we see happening with Putin. You could argue that exactly what you're saying, Ilko, because his reign is crumbling, because his economy isn't working, because all his claims to diversity and innovation and restoration are not working. The only thing that he is able to fall back onto is complete loyalty and submission of the Russian people and the ideology.
Right.
So it's the only thing he has left. And so far, that's of course the million-dollar question. To what extent do Russians really believe this? Well, perhaps they don't know themselves, but no one dares openly to disbelieve it.
No. One more question on historical perspective, and which has nothing to do or not much to do with what we just discussed. But it's very tempting for many people to make, for many journalists also, to make analogies, to say we're in a new Cold War. The current crisis, especially when the talk about nukes has begun, is comparable to the Cuba crisis, for instance. As an historian, I believe you are more skeptical about historical analogies, or not?
Well, I like to use them a lot with students, and then to completely wipe them off the table. No,
that's what I mean. Yeah.
No, they are very helpful. Also to highlight what's the same and what's different. For example, the analogy with the Cuba crisis, it's a very helpful analogy, because it shows us what's so different now. What's different now is that there is a war going on. There wasn't a war at the time of the Cuba crisis, so they were approaching each other. But there was not anything to the equivalent of this going on as we speak.
There was no hot war, it was all
no
cold.
hot war at all. So that's something that's completely different. What's also different is that it was back then two superpowers that were opposing each other, and it's now Russia against Ukraine.
Right.
And Russia is still hoping that it can leave this whole nuclear confrontation out of it. I mean, I'm not saying that
it is a proxy war. I mean, the US is involved, obviously.
Of course, but it's not fighting directly against a country with nukes.
Right.
But that also is a difference from the Cold War. We never had a proxy war in Europe so hot.
No. So does that mean that if you say it's hard to compare it to the Cuba crisis because right now we do have a hot war, does that mean that this is a more dangerous time than back then?
That's also difficult to estimate. I mean, there were situations where, as soon as you start to play with or make operational the nuclear option, and you give human beings only a button push away from launching a nuclear war, then there's always a huge risk involved. Right. And there are several movies made out of it that clever officials or captains saw that they'd rather not should push the button, although they thought that they were being given the direction to do so. So nowadays it's Putin who has that button, and he does not want to push it yet. I don't think that it's really his choice of option or scenario at all, but he is increasing the likelihood that it will happen.
Isn't the difference with back then, and isn't it also that, not that it's really comforting, but the nuclear weapons now are much smaller? I mean, back then, if the Cuba crisis would have ended with a bang, it would have been bad. Obviously, any nuclear weapon now would be bad, but these are small nuclear tactical weapons that can be used on the battlefield, or not?
Yeah, but Putin knows. I mean, this is, of course, still kind of a mind game that we're playing, and there's been lots of these games written out and spelled out for us. But as soon as Putin will dare to launch a small nuke, small meaning that he's not going to obliterate big parts of European country. So either he does it in the stratosphere, he does it against a smaller country in Ukraine. Well, first of all, it will then if he does it on the ground in the Ukraine, near the Ukraine, it will fall out on Russia as well. Also with the winds and the whole atmosphere there, it will fall down, the detriments to fall out literally on Russia as well. Then it won't have any bearing on the military campaign of the Ukraine whatsoever, because launching a small nuke sounds strange, but it's a very static affair. You hit one piece of territory, and our army vehicles can move very quickly, so they're probably not being hit at all. So you don't really undermine the military capacity of Ukraine if you do so.
It will mainly be a scary...
It will be very scary, but it will also unleash a huge counterblow, perhaps first conventional, by NATO and the US, in a sense that Putin won't be able to withstand that. So it's very unlikely, and also very, how do you say, it won't produce much tactical, not even strategic gains for him.
Right.
So it would be truly ideological if he does it, apocalyptical.
Are there questions about Putin, Russia, the historical perspective? Yeah.
Recently, we had recently before 24th of February, there were some demands that Russia put to the West, and to keep it short, that NATO should go back to the borders of 1997. Was that something that Putin and his entourage could think that would be accepted, or was it just something to have in the hand to put the trigger? You didn't listen to us, and here we are.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ruud. Nice to see you here. That's an excellent question.
I missed the first part of the question.
Yeah.
I heard 97, but maybe you can repeat it.
Yes, sorry. The question was, just before the war started, in February 24, the Russians issued a demand, they put a demand on the table, that NATO should withdraw within the borders of 1997. Right. Yeah. Russia put on the table several demands. They also put on the table the demand that NATO would promise that no other country would join NATO, that EU would do the same, that Zelensky would pledge himself neutral or being an EU satellite, that Poland would enter to negotiate. So they issued lots of demands, which doesn't mean that he didn't take the demands himself quite seriously. I've now been telling you the story, which I think is really important, that we should understand that the radicalization process Russia and Putin is undergoing is inspired by their own motivations and by their own weaknesses and their own delusions and alternative scenarios that they've been depicting. That's not to say that context doesn't matter. And of course, EU and NATO haven't helped this radicalization process much. And there perhaps is the naivete, Ilko. It's not that they should not have tried to engage Russia and all those deals and energy agreements, but it's that they didn't really want to see what was going on with this cultural radicalization, ideological radicalization processes. And that from this mindset on, that's also perhaps where my work as a terrorism radicalization expert comes in. If you already are developing a radical mindset, you perceive and you understand and see things differently. And that's something that the EU and the US should have seen coming, because it also affects them, of course. So I do think we should have considered that demand, Ruud, more carefully, more seriously.
Thank you for the question. Are there any other questions in the back? And then over there. Yeah.
Question. So Russia has 16 million ethnic minorities, and a lot of them are Muslim. You mentioned growing Christian rhetoric. How do you think Putin has to contend with this? I obviously don't think he wants a first or second Chechen war on his hands again while fighting with Ukraine.
I didn't really understand the question.
So he has Muslims in his country, a huge amount, and he's going with this Christian rhetoric. How does he balance that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and we try to address that in our article as well. It has to do with what I tried to explain before, that from 2000 onwards, Putin was developing this Christian Orthodox ideology. But at first, he made room within that ideology where he said the Russian Empire also always has been a multi-ethnic empire. It also has been a house for many peoples. And connected to that is also the invention of the Ruski Mir concept that he also came up lately and wrote his essay on in last year, June, where he said, even if you're not ethnic Russian, if you're not Christian, as long as you're willing to accept the Russianness of our state, you can play along. It doesn't matter if you're black, it doesn't matter if you're Muslim, you just have to play by our rules and speak Russian and act your part, which is, of course, highly oppressive to minorities, and it changed over time. And you also see now that at first, I think it was around 2005, 2006, Putin still visited mosques and was open about the importance of Muslim peoples. Also because he, of course, didn't want to lose support from the Jan and the Stan republics around his sphere of influence. But you don't hear him voice that kind of inclusive language anymore nowadays. It's Greater Russia, it's White Russia, it's Christian, and all the others are Nazis or Satanists.
Right. Over here, there was a question, yeah.
Thank you very much for your interesting analysis of the internal processes of Russia. The title of the lecture tonight is Europe's Revival. Can you tell something more about that issue? What has that to do with?
Yeah, I mean, you shouldn't invite an historian of war, conflict, and terrorism if you want to talk about nice things.
I think it's a beautiful bridge to the last part of this
interview. It's the third part of our evening.
That's exactly what we're getting at. So I'll take it from here, but jump in with additional questions. But you're right, Europe's revival. That's what we wanted to end this evening with. Because this crisis could leave the impression that Europe is in a very bad shape. You know, over the past years, countries threatening to leave the EU, problems at its borders. You just mentioned migration earlier. It's very easy to build a negative narrative about Europe. But is that narrative justified? I think you're more of an optimist.
No. I'm not sure if I am an optimist, but I subscribe to Bloch's dictum, das Prinzip Hoffnung. As a historian, you should be gearing yourselves and your students towards and betterments, towards hope, because otherwise, what are you teaching the next generation for? So as a teacher, I cannot do the things that I'm doing without being hopeful, because I also see that there's always agency with people also in Russia who want to do better things. But now about the crisis, I need to...
You're not twittering, right?
I'm not... Wait a minute, I'm looking up this citation of Jean Monnet. And Jean Monnet was one of the founding fathers of the first European cooperation mechanisms. His sister, by the way, was close friends with the Pope. So it was also a very Christian-inspired family, Catholic family. And he said, the early beginnings, he said, I have always believed that Europe would be built through and during crisis, and that only in crisis times there would arrive the sum of their solutions. So it may also sound a bit cynical, but it's true that Europe has expanded over the past 200 years, because I myself I'm always very much interested in the early 19th century, the 19th century first beginnings of symmetry and modern diplomacy as we know it now, the Concert of Europe, the Congress of Vienna. It could be considered the real and true predecessor of the European community right now. So it's not the League of Nations, it's really already beginning with the nations, the nation states in the 19th century. And what Monnet rightly says, it's either through times of war, the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, the Franco-German War, the First World War and the Second World War, when Europe really has made gigantic leaps in working closer together and bringing economic unity and peace. So it's military and economics that has always been the driving force behind European cooperation. And then there's the big economic crisis. the financial crisis, the inflation crisis, but also the health-related crisis. And we had the Spanish flu after the First World War, where also European powers, countries worked together hard and created the international health system. And today we see the same happening again. So in that sense, I am hopeful that because we do see countries in Europe working together very hard in times of crisis, and I mentioned the crisis in the beginning, the financial crisis, the refugee migrant crisis, the pandemic crisis, now the Ukraine crisis. If you consider the amount of money, I mean, it started with the Eurobond and the Eurozone situation, which Merkel or Schäuble was always dead against, and then at once 800 billion euros were spent on that, and now we have those bonds, and up on that come more, 3 billion euros a year for Ukraine now, or a month for Ukraine, coming months from the US and the EU. That's amazing what's coming out of Europe right now. That's not to say, I mean, now I'm perhaps too rosy-eyed on this. It's not to say that it will go smoothly. I mean, we already see the rifts opening up again, strangely enough, between Germany and the rest. The Germans, because what's happening right now is that France, but also other countries, the Netherlands not so much, but Italy, are blaming Germany for now wanting to making the same mistakes that they did with Russia and
China.
not seeing what's going to happen with China.
Right.
Scholz opened up a huge port for the Chinese. Right now he visited China. Most of the export on solar panels, rare materials, what else have you? It's all coming from China, and the Germans need that, and they're not trying to look for different solutions right now. They're completely dependent on China, so making the same error as they made with Russia, perhaps.
I mean, the phrase is, I think it was one of Obama's advisors that once keyed it, never let a good crisis go to waste.
Yes.
This is a pretty big crisis. When this war is over, because one day it probably will be over, let's hope so. How do you think Europe may have come better out of it?
Build back better.
Build back better. Yeah, that was not a success.
No, not really. That Europe's revival. That's what you want to hear about,
right.
Lady from the audience as well. Well, the revival is there, but it's sometimes hard to witness. The revival is there in the sense that we're not dissolving, they're not falling apart, not the north and the south, not the east and the west, that the Eurobonds, the Eurozone are still there as leftovers. Better situation than there was before the financial crisis, in the sense that Europe has now a much quicker, rapid response force in financial terms. The next step would be, after this crisis, what really would make Europe better is that it has a more rapid response military type of force, producing military materials, hardware materials, together in a more efficient manner. And
not within NATO, but outside of NATO.
No, they are already doing that outside of NATO.
Right.
There are the Dutch... I'm not an economic historian, but there's all these companies that are building huge submarines, ships, and aircraft, and they're doing that already together, and they try to work together. Scandinavian countries, the Dutch and the French. I'm not going into detail because I don't know the specifics, but recently I visited a huge a dockyard in Vlissingen, where European-wise ships are being created and built and delivered to the countries. And that's something that Europeans should do together. And they should also organize themselves better. It's now the Dutch and the Germans that work very closely together, but the Dutch and the French and other people in the Mediterranean are now also more manning fleet and marine ships together. So that's something where you could seriously improve European cooperation, but it's still piecemeal, and that's also part of the European history, that it hardly ever comes with a huge bang or revolution. It's an increase, it's a stepping up, but it's very sui generis. It's all very haphazardly, piecemeal-like.
Do you think the idea of Europe, because sometimes you need a common enemy to feel that you're part of something, do you feel among the European audiences that the idea of Europe and why we're here, this never again, that out of this war that idea will be stronger?
I'm not so sure. I think I'm safely to say that the average age of this audience is above 40. That's a safe bet, I think.
I'm not going there.
So let's say the generations above 40 or above 45 are generations higher
We're
up.
just exactly as old, so yes.
Exactly, so always 45.
Go on.
Yeah, that generation, that's still, perhaps we are the last generation, we witnessed the fall of the wall, or I did when I was 13 years old, made huge impression, then experienced...
13 years old.
13 years old, 13. Yes, exactly, yeah. And then experienced the long 19s, the long peace, the New World Order. In the Netherlands, the Foreign Intelligence Service was disbanded in 1994 because Ruud Lubbers, it's not the Green Left, Ruud Lubbers thought that the world was now safe for democracy, the end of history, and we didn't need a foreign intelligence service anymore because there were no enemies. We were friends, all of us together, the liberals. And, I grew up in that age, meaning that for me, European integration, coming together, the implementation of the euro was all part and parcel, but also a signpost for eternal peace and liberalism and this new world order. And then it came back down together, but then I was already over my 4 years old, and the most influential moments are the moments that you grew up with between your 12 and 22 years old. So the generation that grows up now, I'm not so sure whether they see the EU as a rescuing vehicle. They see it as part of this eternal crisis, always bickering, there's not enough knowledge. So we were brought up by teachers who came directly after the Second World War and were telling us the stories about us, the European integration, the French-German friendship, which was still, very hot and happening, even in the 70s and the 80s. So there is this distance from the Second World War, and I'm not so sure whether this war will forge a new generation together around this ideal of Europe. I'm not so sure yet. I hope so, but I'm not sure.
How do you think, and that's my final question before maybe the audience has questions, how would Putin look at Europe right now?
I think he's greatly disappointed. He thinks that bunch of decadent, cowardice, people run by this fragile woman, von der Leyen, how could they ever stand up against me? It also really depends, and that's a question to you, about what's going on in the US right now. What if Biden doesn't have any clout to work with anymore? What happens then? So just now, I think Putin and Zelensky are very nervously looking at what's happening in the US. Before, Putin was, I think, far more disappointed by the EU's performance. He thought the EU would not work together as well as it did, I think.
Right. Well, I guess the Americans, there's still a lot of support for the Ukrainian policy of the Biden administration. I think about 70% or 60%, but it did go down from 70. And the Republicans, even though the Democrats, and that's interesting because the Democrats were always obviously the more, the more less involved, less inclined to get involved militarily, and now they're fully behind Biden because it's their president.
But are they fully behind Biden?
Well, I mean, there was a progressive wing of the Democratic Party that came out with a letter saying we have to negotiate, and that was pulled back immediately. So, I mean, the risk right now, if you're on Biden's side, the risk is that the Republicans will win both houses of Congress tonight, and that I think the next few, there will still be money sent, and it will be millions, but it may get less next year.
Millions of billions?
No, it will probably still be billions, but it will probably be less because there's about a third of the Democratic or of the Republican politicians on Capitol Hill that say we are, like Trump's phrase was, we need money to go to Pittsburgh, not Paris.
Yes.
And you hear that again right now. And
so are they winning now? What do you think?
Sorry?
Are they winning, the Republicans, tonight?
Well, I mean, they'll win the House probably, and the Senate, they have a good chance. Yeah. But we're here for you. Audience questions. I'm sure.
We do have one online question. Does strategic autonomy require an European green weapon industry?
Again, it's very the auditive quality.
With regard to the future of Europe, would you say that we need a European weapon industry?
Weapon industry.
Yeah, we already have a European weapon industry, quite a strong one, but you should not ask me about the details for that. But buying aircraft, planes, producing military materials, munition, there's a strong industry in Europe, but they're working together with countries that are not so democratic, Qatar and other countries, Saudi Arabia. So it's a web of an industry that's not completely European. Strategic autonomy is now very much the buzzword, and all national security councils in Europe and committees are advocating to get the strategic autonomy of the foreign and the common European security policy more together. And I think...
What does it mean, sorry to interrupt, strategic autonomy? Because you do keep, it is a buzzword, but nobody's really clear about what it means.
No, it can mean that you're not depending on other countries for your military equipment or personnel. It can also mean that you're not dependent on other countries for economic resources, not dependent on China for rare materials, for example. It can also mean that you're not dependent from other countries, you're not tied up in treaties and collective international law security obligations.
Right.
So it can mean different things and different layers of analysis.
Other questions? I think we have time for 2 or 3.
Yes. In the back.
There are some economists, notably Peter Zayan, that predict that the Russian state will collapse in the next 50 years due to the demographic crunch. How do you factor this in your story?
The question was that some economists think that the Russian state will collapse in 50 years. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Well, I'm a bit surprised that you ask an historian to look in the future, not just for the next 1 year, but for 50 years. I mean, if anything shows it's events, my dear.
Events, my dear.
Yeah,
Macmillan,
it's
right?
Macmillan who said that. No one predicted the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which completely resettles or resets the history of the EU. So I'm not going to say anything about the next 50 years. I wouldn't even say something about the next year. I think the only way in the future that I'd be able to pierce is the next 3 or 4 months up until the next military campaign, because how those dice will roll will very much determine if Putin dies or is being pushed out of the defenestration, put out some window, and another person comes into place, negotiations take place, Kherson will be full. It's a completely different situation also for the Russians themselves. I really find that very hard. What you could safely predict is that Putin cannot continue in this way financially, nor based on human resources. If you listen to reports, the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg are empty of young men, and men as such. There's not just hiding. There's now over 70,000 Russian soldiers that died, fled, the brain drain of human capital. So that alone, and Putin is not getting his resources back in time. This whole talk of Putin getting his materials from China or India, they're all in their backseats waiting, and they're not very keen on doing deals with Putin
There's
right now.
There's basically no way back for him after this war, right?
He could stop, and I think
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be in his nature, but...
No. Europe's revival won't come from Putin. I think that's true.
Right.
Yeah.
We do have one last question.
One last question, okay.
Well, thank you very much for your information. It was very helpful analyzing. I have a question about your perspective on, we see a decline in democracy around the world for the last 12 years, so much. It's another perspective than we had 25 years ago with the Berlin Wall fall, the Soviet Union was collapsing. and the last 12 years, there's a decline in democracy, and you also talked about revival of Europe. And nowadays we have Hungary, we have Belarus, and we also have Russia. You talked about their ideology and a rise in authoritarian regimes. What is your perspective on that in the last 12 years, and maybe also in the revival of Europe? What is going on?
Well, you're right. There is a contradiction in those two tendencies. The first tendency is that Freedom House, that's a monitor agency that worldwide maps and traces developments of democracy, has witnessed an increase of illiberal democracy. So on paper, constitutionally, countries are still democracies, but they're turning more illiberal as we speak.
Like Poland, Hungary.
Poland, Hungary, partly perhaps the US in some parts of it. I wouldn't call that an illiberal democracy yet. Brazil, perhaps, but then again, Brazil swept back, but Israel went in the more far-right direction. So indeed, an increase in the number of illiberal democracies, which ties in with the rise of populist leaders and demagogues, which again also is dependent on the arrival of social media in our lives, because the last 12 years, Twitter as such, we only have Twitter since 2011 or 2012. We only have Instagram and TikTok and what have you, and that the world is connected to Facebook from 2005-07 and all those other things only over the past 5, 6, 7 years. So it's still a very novel situation that we live in. And perhaps the biggest difference with the Cold War is, and that's also that people steeped very deeply in diplomatic training say, what makes the world so difficult right now is that the global public space has become a survival of the fittest. He who shouts the loudest and says the most brutal and cruel things wins the day because he grabs our attention. And diplomacy, that's why the 19th century was such a heyday for diplomacy. Diplomacy demands less transparency, more longer and more delayed times, more temperance, more moderation behind the scenes. Everything that demagogues and populists and we all together hate nowadays. We don't like backroom scenes. We don't like behind the curtain settings. We want to know what's going on. But as soon as you oblige or you compel a leader to put his cards on the table, there's no wriggle room anymore, no room for negotiation. So that's making it's very hard for democracies to bargain and compromise because they have to sell it back home. That's also one of the reasons why Rutte doesn't like to speak about it at all. He doesn't want to brag or be transparent about it. So that's putting a heavy strain on Europe's survival. So the rise of illiberal democracies, these structural developments in history, they're really putting a strain on Europe's survival. And who knows what's going to happen with Twitter nowadays. If social media, can it be patrolled? Can it be democratized in a way that it also respects basic human dignity? I'm not sure.
It's amazing that we thought for a little while in the beginning of Twitter, during the Arab Spring, etc., there was a strength to it, right? In order to organize, and now we look at Twitter, I guess, very differently.
It still is a bit. I also saw on Twitter that people were still saying, well, we want to be on Twitter because for Uyghurs in China, for people in Hungary, for people in Brazil, it's the only way to reach out to get information, or Iran, for example, to get information that they won't get via their own systems. So there still is this potent resource of information materials, but it isn't. With Jürgen Habermas, it isn't a fair and a reasonable place where arguments are being settled on the basis of objective, evidence-based facts and figures. It's, as I said, survival of the fittest.
Final question, and I know that we have to be brief, but we've asked that to the other two guests. If there's one brief takeaway for tonight that you want the audience to take away, perhaps after this, perhaps something optimistic would always help.
Well, crisis always helps to make things fluid, and the military cooperation of Europe, no one had dreamed before the 24th of February that the French and the Germans and the Dutch would fight together and get their stuff together military as they're doing now.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Let's give a warm applause.
Dank je.
Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you, Ilko. And thank you all for listening and posing these interesting questions. Before you leave this university hall, I would like to ask you to fill out our impact tool, and then you help us to improve our programs even further. So you can do that by scanning the QR code. And thank you all for your contribution and have a nice evening.
Dankjewel.